Barron Trump just did the unthinkable, calling his father live on TV, asking for a DNA test to uncover the truth about his mother. His emotional breakdown left everyone stunned. But when he declared, "This lie has to be faced," and walked off the set, the world was left asking, what just happened? It was supposed to be just another normal TV appearance, something Barron Trump had done before, with little to no drama. The setting was calm, a late-night talk show hosted by a popular TV personality. The show had a reputation for lighthearted discussions, often featuring political figures and public personalities. Barron was there to talk about family, life in the public eye, and maybe even throw in some thoughts about growing up in one of the most famous families in America. But this time, things were different. This time, Barron was about to find himself in the middle of a storm he never saw coming. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had also been invited as a guest that evening. Known for her quick wit and fearless style, she was no stranger to controversy. For months, she had been a vocal critic of the Trump family, particularly President Donald Trump, and his influence on American politics. Jasmine didn't hold back, whether it was on the floor of the House or in interviews. She wasn't one to sugarcoat her opinions, and she had earned a reputation for taking on the Trump family hidden. So, when it was announced that both Barron and Jasmine would be on the same show, no one could have predicted just how explosive the encounter would be. As Barron walked into the studio that night, he looked like he was ready for a simple, uneventful conversation. Dressed in his usual, smart, casual style, with a quiet confidence that seemed to come naturally, Barron had no idea what he was about to face. He had spent most of his life avoiding the media, carefully stepping out of the limelight that had always surrounded his father. But on this night, it was impossible to avoid the clash that was coming. Jasmine Crockett was already on stage when Barron entered, sitting calmly and waiting for her turn to speak. She greeted Barron with a polite nod, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that couldn't be ignored. The two hadn't interacted much before, but their names were frequently mentioned together in the media, often as adversaries. It wasn't long before the conversation turned tense. The host began by asking Barron about his life as a young man growing up in the Trump household. Barron, as expected, answered with his usual level of restraint, offering a few brief but thoughtful remarks. But then, out of nowhere, Barron suddenly said something that caught everyone off guard. "That Afrikaan is here again. I don't want to sit here. I'm leaving." The words hit the room like a bolt of lightning. The audience, the crew, and even the host were left in stunned silence. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way Barron said them with a casualness that was almost chilling. That Afrikaan, the way he said it, made everyone in the room feel uneasy. It was one of those moments when you could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Jasmine Crockett was caught completely off guard. She had expected Barron to be a little guarded, maybe even aloof, but she never expected him to react like this. It was a direct attack, an insult, and a slap in the face, especially considering that Jasmine was a black woman, a representative for people of color, and someone who had worked tirelessly for equality. For a brief moment, Jasmine didn't say anything. Her gaze fixed on Barron, her face showing no sign of anger, but a mix of disbelief and calm fury. The host, sensing the growing tension, quickly tried to intervene, asking Barron what was going on, trying to defuse the situation. But Barron, still visibly irritated, wasn't having any of it. He crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, clearly agitated. Jasmine, however, was not one to be rattled. After a moment of silence, she turned to Barron, locking eyes with him. Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying sharpness in her words. "Kid, what problem do you have with me?" she asked. It was a simple question, but in that moment, it carried so much weight. Barron's face twitched, and for the first time, he seemed unsure of how to respond. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but hesitated, caught in the tension of the moment. Then finally, he fired back. "Show me your American identity," he said, his voice cold. The words felt like a challenge, one that Jasmine could not ignore. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, the question hanging in the air. "I've shown it many times," she replied, her calmness almost unnerving in the face of Barron's escalating hostility. The audience was on edge, unsure how the situation would unfold. Barron was clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, but Jasmine's poise only seemed to make the tension worse. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy as they waited for Barron to speak. Everyone knew this was no longer just a political disagreement. This was something personal. What started as a casual interview had transformed into a confrontation. No one was certain if this was something that could be mended or if it would spiral into something much bigger. Jasmine had always been known for being unflinching in the face of challenges, but even she couldn't have predicted this. Barron's anger, his refusal to back down, and the strange bitterness in his words were signs of something deeper, something that was now unfolding in front of a live audience. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it wasn't just a difference of opinions. This was personal, and from that moment on, it was clear that this live TV appearance was going to be anything but ordinary. What started as a simple discussion had turned into a high-stakes confrontation with Barron Trump and Jasmine Crockett both standing firm in their beliefs, unwilling to give an inch. The stage was set for what would become a shocking, unforgettable moment in the public eye. As Barron's words hung in the air, the atmosphere in the studio shifted. There was a palpable tension that everyone could feel, an electric charge that seemed to crackle with each passing second. The audience, still in shock from Barron's sudden outburst, was now staring at Jasmine Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond. She could have easily reacted with anger, firing back with sharp words. But instead, Jasmine stayed calm, almost unnervingly so. For a moment, it seemed like the room had gone quiet, as if time itself had slowed down. Barron, sitting with his arms crossed and his face set in defiance, seemed ready for a confrontation. His comment about Jasmine being that African had hit a nerve and everyone could see it. But Jasmine, instead of succumbing to the heat of the moment, took a breath and stared back at Barron with a steady gaze. Her eyes were sharp, but her expression was calm, almost too calm for someone who had just been insulted on live television. She wasn't about to let Barron's words get the better of her, and in that instant, it became clear that she wasn't intimidated by him or by the situation. In fact, her poise only seemed to fuel the tension more. "Kid," Jasmine said, her voice clear and measured. "What problem do you have with me?" It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. There was no hint of anger, no raised voice or aggressive tone, just a calm, cutting question that seemed to catch Barron off guard. The studio audience, still processing the shock of Barron's comment, held their breath. What would Barron do now? Would he back down or would he double down? Barron shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jasmine. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not in such a cool, collected manner. For a brief moment, he looked like he didn't know how to respond. The words he had just spoken seemed to linger in the air, and it was clear that he had no idea how much trouble they had caused. Finally, he spoke again, but this time his words felt more defensive, almost like he was trying to justify his earlier remark. "Show me your American identity," Barron said, his voice carrying a tone that bordered on demand. It was a strange challenge to throw out. Jasmine's American identity was never in question. She was a congresswoman elected by the people to represent them in Washington. But Barron's words suggested something else. A need to question her legitimacy, to force her to prove something that didn't need to be proven. It was as if he was trying to paint her as an outsider, an intruder, even though she had every right to be where she was. Jasmine's response was swift and without hesitation. "I've shown it many times," she said, her voice as steady as ever. Her reply didn't come across as a rebuttal, but rather as a simple fact. It was almost like she was giving Barron an answer he should have already known. But Barron, still not backing down, seemed to want more. A piece of evidence, something tangible that could prove his point, whatever it was. The tension in the room thickened. Barron wasn't done yet, and Jasmine knew it. He had the look of someone who felt cornered, who needed to prove something, even if the logic behind it didn't make sense. Barron's next words would be the real test of whether this situation would spiral further or if it could be reined in. "I want you to show the public your DNA reports," Barron said suddenly, his tone rising slightly as he leaned forward in his chair. The request, unexpected and strange, stunned the audience once more. DNA reports. The comment seemed to come out of nowhere, and yet it made sense in the context of the heated conversation. Barron was looking for a way to challenge Jasmine on a personal level, to push back in a way that wasn't just political, but deeply invasive. He was trying to put her on the defensive, to force her to prove something about herself that wasn't necessary. Jasmine's response was quick and resolute. "I've shown them before," she said flatly. Her answer was confident, and she didn't shy away from Barron's strange request. But Barron wasn't satisfied. He leaned in again, clearly trying to push the envelope, testing Jasmine's patience, testing her resolve. But what Barron said next, what came out of his mouth, was something no one could have predicted. "My mother is Melania," he stated, the words coming out in a sharp, almost defensive tone. It was an odd declaration, especially considering that it wasn't a question, but a statement of certainty. Everyone in the room, including Jasmine, was left wondering what he meant by that. Was Barron admitting doubt about his own family structure? Did he question the very woman who raised him? The statement was jarring, unexpected, and raised more questions than it answered. Jasmine, however, wasn't fazed. She was ready for it. "If you know that," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "why delay doing a DNA test? According to some DNA reports I have, your mother is of You even asked your dad to prove it wrong by doing a DNA test. So why no test yet?" The words she spoke seemed to hit Barron like a ton of bricks. For a moment, he seemed stunned, his face contorting with disbelief and confusion. Jasmine had just thrown a bombshell of her own, one that left Barron speechless. She wasn't just questioning his mother. She was calling him out on something that had been circulating in whispers, something that was now being brought to the public eye. The DNA test, something Barron had apparently considered, was suddenly no longer just a personal issue. It had become public, and Jasmine had just made sure everyone knew about it. In that instant, it felt like the entire room had tilted. The ground beneath Barron's feet was shaking. and he could do nothing but sit there trying to process what had just been thrown at him. The fight wasn't just between two politicians anymore. It was between two people who were locked in a battle of words, each trying to expose the other in ways that were personal, raw, and brutally real. Jasmine's words hung in the air like a challenge, and Barron was left to face them, his silence the only response he could muster. The room seemed to hold its breath as the conversation took an even darker turn. Barron Trump, still visibly rattled by JasmineCrockett's.com, yet cutting responses, shifted uneasily in his seat. His earlier remarks, which had caused such a stir, now felt like they were spiraling out of control, and Barron knew it. But instead of retreating or backing down, he doubled down, almost as if he were trying to claw his way out of the uncomfortable position he had put himself in. Jasmine, however, wasn't one to let a moment like this slip by. Her calm demeanor hadn't faltered once. In fact, she seemed to draw strength from the growing tension in the room. The audience, caught between shock and curiosity, leaned in as Barron prepared for his next move. He wasn't done. The questions that had been swirling in his mind now had to be aired, and it seemed like he was prepared to drag everyone into his private turmoil. "I want you to show the public your DNA reports," Barron said, his words spilling out with a sense of urgency. It wasn't just a question anymore, it was an accusation wrapped in a challenge. His voice, once smooth and controlled, had an edge to it now, like he was desperate to turn the tables. The statement seemed to catch Jasmine off guard, though she didn't show it. To anyone watching, it was clear that Barron was trying to push her into a corner. The nature of the request was strange and uncomfortable, as though Barron wanted to expose something hidden, something deeply personal. Jasmine's response was simple, yet it had a weight to it. "I've shown them before," she said matter-of-factly. There was no hesitation, no defensive tone in her voice. She was used to questions like these, used to being challenged by people who thought they could rattle her. But Barron was relentless, and as the tension in the room reached its peak, he pressed on. "I'm not talking about just showing it," Barron shot back, his voice rising. "I'm talking about real proof. You need to show everyone that you're truly American, that you belong here." Jasmine didn't flinch. She could have easily let the conversation veer off into accusations and counter-accusations, but she wasn't here to entertain Barron's personal vendettas. She was here to make a point, to stand firm in the face of disrespect, and to make it clear that she wouldn't let Barron drag her down into the pit he was trying to create. The question that Barron had raised, though, about her identity, her right to be where she was, wasn't something new. It was the same sort of rhetoric that had been thrown at her before. It was the sort of attack designed to undermine her, to make her feel like an outsider. Despite her position as a U.S. Congresswoman, Barron was trying to weaponize her background to throw her into a position where she would have to constantly defend herself. But Jasmine wasn't having it. Instead of responding directly to Barron's provocation, she turned the tables, her voice steady and unwavering. "Why don't you ask your own father for a DNA test?" she said. The room froze. It was a bombshell that no one had seen coming. Jasmine was calling Barron's bluff. She wasn't just going to let him turn this into an attack on her. It was suddenly about Barron's own family. "I've seen the reports," Jasmine continued, her tone even, "and they're not as clear-cut as you'd like to believe. I've heard the rumors, Barron. I've heard about the DNA tests that your father was supposed to take to prove who your mother is." Barron's face shifted, a flash of emotion crossing his features. It was a look of surprise, then confusion, followed by something darker. Something like realization that Jasmine had just dropped a truth that hit closer to home than he had expected. He stared at her, mouth slightly open, but he couldn't speak. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge that he wasn't prepared to answer. Jasmine's words were powerful, not just because they called into question Barron's own doubts about his family, but because they forced him to confront a truth he had clearly been avoiding. The idea that Barron might have doubts about his own identity, that there were rumors circulating about his paternity, was a revelation. It was a deeply personal matter, and for it to be aired on national television was nothing short of explosive. Barron opened his mouth, perhaps to respond, but nothing came out. The room was alive with the sound of quiet gasps from the audience. The implication of Jasmine's words was too much. She wasn't just questioning his actions or his words. She was questioning the very foundation of who he was, of who his family was. And she wasn't backing down. "If you're so sure of your mother's identity," Jasmine said, her voice now cutting through the tension with precision, "then why hasn't a DNA test been done? Why wait? You had the opportunity. Why leave it hanging?" Barron's eyes darted nervously, and his jaw clenched. It was clear he didn't have an answer. He was caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, he had made these claims. He had said that Melania Trump was his mother and that everything about his family was clear. On the other hand, Jasmine's revelation about Ivanka Trump and the supposed DNA tests added a layer of complexity that Barron hadn't been prepared for. The audience was still in shock, unsure of what to make of the accusations and the silence that followed. But in that moment, Barron looked small. The confident young man who had first spoken with such conviction now seemed like a boy lost in a conversation that was far beyond his ability to control. His words had spiraled, and now he was caught in the aftermath, unable to reclaim the narrative. Jasmine, on the other hand, stood tall. She had exposed the cracks in Barron's story and made him face something far more difficult than political differences. She had forced him to confront the personal, the uncomfortable, and the unresolved. It was a moment of clarity, a rare one where the game of politics gave way to something more human, and for Barron, it was a moment he would never forget. The tension in the room felt like it had reached a boiling point, and everyone could sense it. Barron Trump, shaken and visibly caught off guard, was now facing a question he didn't want to answer, a bombshell he hadn't anticipated. He had made his accusations and challenged Jasmine Crockett in ways no one could have expected, but Jasmine had hit back hard, forcing him into a corner. Her words had not only questioned the very foundation of his family, but it also opened up a floodgate of uncomfortable truths he wasn't ready to face. Barron's emotions seemed to be boiling over, and for a brief moment, he lost the calm, composed demeanor that had always been associated with him. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest of his chair. This wasn't just another public appearance where he could offer a polite smile and say a few scripted words. This was real, and it was playing out live in front of millions of people. The studio felt almost too quiet in that moment. No one knew exactly how Barron would respond, but everyone knew that whatever happened next would shape this moment into something unforgettable. His phone had been sitting on the table next to him, untouched until now. But as the silence stretched on, Barron's fingers hovered over the screen. He wasn't looking at anyone anymore. His focus was on that phone as if it were his only lifeline in that chaotic moment. Slowly, almost mechanically, Barron reached for his phone, unlocked it, and brought it up to his ear. The room held its breath. Was he going to call his father? Would Donald Trump, the most powerful man in the world, really pick up the phone during a live broadcast? The answer came quickly. Barron's voice was quiet, almost shaky, as he spoke into the phone. "Dad, I need a DNA test to know who my mother really is," he said, his words coming out with a rawness that no one had expected. There was something vulnerable in his voice, a rare moment of doubt that cut through the bravado he had worn throughout the evening. This wasn't just about public personas or political battles anymore. This was about something personal, something that until now had stayed hidden in the shadows. The camera zoomed in slightly on Barron's face as he spoke, his eyes locked on the floor, his body tense as if he were waiting for his father's voice on the other end of the line to provide the clarity he so desperately needed. His words hung in the air long after he finished the call, and the room was thick with silence, with everyone waiting for the inevitable aftermath. What could Donald Trump possibly say to his son in this moment? Was there an answer that could make sense of this chaos? Barron's face, which had been flushed with frustration moments earlier, now seemed lost, almost fragile. It was the kind of expression one might expect from a teenager trying to make sense of a broken world. But here, Barron was a young man at the center of one of the most public and intense political confrontations in recent memory. As the call ended, Barron slowly lowered his phone and looked up. His eyes met the camera for the first time since the call began, and for a split second, it seemed like he was trying to compose himself to regain the control he had lost earlier. But the damage had already been done. His vulnerability was now exposed, and the audience had witnessed it all. "I'm not sitting here anymore," Barron declared, his voice steadier than before, but still carrying a sense of emotional weight. "This lie has to be faced." His words were clear, but there was a sense of finality to them, like a decision had been made, and there was no going back. Barron stood up from his seat, his movements slow but deliberate. It was a symbolic act, a defiant gesture that signaled he was done with the conversation, done with the questioning. He was leaving. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Barron turned toward the exit. There was no more debate, no more fighting. Barron Trump, who had always been the quiet, reserved figure in the Trump family, was now walking off the set, leaving everything hanging in the air behind him. The audience, still processing everything that had just happened, didn't know whether to applaud, gasp, or remain silent. The event had just taken an incredibly personal turn, and it was clear that this wasn't something Barron would easily walk away from. As he walked out, there was an almost eerie stillness in the room. Jasmine Crockett, who had been at the center of the confrontation, remained in her seat, looking calm but thoughtful. She hadn't expected Barron's reaction to be so raw, so emotional, but she had made her point. She had pushed Barron to face the uncomfortable questions he had been avoiding, and in doing so, she had forced a reckoning, not just for him, but for the public as well. For Barron, the moment marked a breaking point. He had come into the show expecting another public appearance, another moment of quiet observation, but what happened instead was a clash of words that peeled back the layers of his carefully constructed life. Barron wasn't just the son of a powerful man anymore. He was a young man struggling to understand his place in a world where everything, including his own identity, was being questioned. And as Barron walked off the stage, one question lingered in the air. What now? What would this moment mean for him, for his family, and for the public that had just witnessed it all? As the cameras cut away and the show came to an awkward close, the world was left with a sense of uncertainty. The phone call, the DNA test, the walkout, it all pointed to something deeper, something that went beyond political differences. This wasn't just about Barron Trump anymore. It was about the complex, messy, and often painful realities of family, identity, and the cost of living your life in the spotlight. The answers might never come, but the questions had already been asked. And for Barron, there was no turning back. As Barron Trump stormed off the set, leaving the tension of the moment to hang heavy in the air, the audience was left in stunned silence. The live broadcast, which had started as a simple political conversation, had now unraveled into something far more personal, far more raw. And as the cameras shifted from Barron's retreating figure, the world was left with a haunting set of questions, ones that no one had expected to be asked on that night, questions that were far more difficult to answer. What had just happened? What had led Barron to react this way? And why, after all the accusations, had he turned to his father, the most powerful man in the country, for help in the middle of the broadcast? The viewers, both in the studio and at home, were left grasping for the answers that Barron had just walked away from. The questions were now unavoidable. What exactly had Barron's father said during that phone call? Was there something being hidden? And why hadn't a DNA test been done if these questions were so serious? The phone call itself was a critical moment in the unfolding drama. Barron's decision to call his father live on air was more than just a personal cry for help. It was an open invitation for the public to peer into a family dynamic that had previously been kept under wraps. Barron had reached out in a moment of crisis, vulnerable and shaken, asking for a DNA test, a question that seemed to shake the very foundation of his identity. But what did that mean? What was the underlying issue here? Was Barron really uncertain about who his mother was? Or was this simply the beginning of a much deeper and more complex personal struggle? In the aftermath of the broadcast, speculation ran wild. People began to wonder, why would Barron ask his father for a DNA test if there was no doubt about his heritage? Was this just a desperate attempt to deflect the accusations made by Jasmine Crockett? Or was there something more troubling beneath the surface? The media, as always, didn't take long to jump on the story, and the questions about Barron's family life became the talk of the nation. What made it even more puzzling was the silence from Donald Trump himself. The president, who had always been outspoken and quick to defend his family, had yet to make a public statement about the incident. Was he waiting for the right moment to address the situation, or was he too caught off guard by his son's outburst? And more importantly, why had Barron felt the need to reach out to him on national television? Was there something about Barron's relationship with his father that hadn't been revealed before? What did it say about the dynamics within the Trump family that Barron, in such a public moment, needed his father's support in such a personal matter? Then there was the issue of the DNA test itself. Jasmine's challenge had been clear. If Barron was so certain about his identity and his family's history, why hadn't a DNA test been done to clear up the rumors once and for all? The suggestion that there had been an ongoing question about Barron's paternity was a revelation in itself. It wasn't just a political accusation, it was something far more private, something that hit much closer to home. And yet, the idea that Barron might have been involved in discussions about a DNA test, especially one involving his mother's identity, had been completely out of the public eye until now. As the dust settled, the questions only multiplied. Why was there so much secrecy surrounding Barron's family? Why had such a simple moment of political discussion turned into a battle over personal identity and family truths? Could it be that Barron, growing up under the constant scrutiny of being a Trump, had developed a complicated relationship with his own sense of self? Was the pressure of living under the shadow of his father, a man who had reshaped American politics, finally starting to take its toll on Barron? In ways the public had never seen before. And then, of course, there was the question of Jasmine Crockett. What had motivated her to bring such a deeply personal matter into the public conversation? Was she simply trying to challenge Barron on his politics? Or did she have a deeper agenda? Her calm, calculated responses had made it clear that she wasn't just fighting a political battle. She was trying to expose something that went beyond politics, beyond Barron's family name. Jasmine had forced Barron to confront uncomfortable truths, ones that even he might not have been ready to face. For Barron, the decision to walk off the set after making that call to his father had been a dramatic, irreversible step. The act of leaving, of rejecting the conversation, had been a statement in itself. But what did it mean for his future? What would this moment do to his public image, to the way people saw him moving forward? Until now, Barron had been the quiet figure in the Trump family, someone who avoided the spotlight as much as possible. But this incident, this very public confrontation, had thrust him into a new role. That of a young man struggling to understand who he was in the face of overwhelming expectations. It wasn't just a political confrontation anymore. This was about family, identity, and the price of being a public figure. Barron had just shown the world a side of himself that few had ever seen. It was a side of vulnerability, of doubt, and of emotion that contradicted the image he had carefully cultivated for years. And now, everyone was left asking the same question. What comes next? Behind the scenes, the Trump family was no doubt trying to piece together the damage done by Barron's public breakdown. Would they step in and offer a statement, or would they remain silent, letting the storm pass? Would Barron's call to his father be answered with the clarity he sought, or would the confusion deepen? As the media continued to buzz and the world speculated, one thing was clear. This moment had changed Barron Trump's life in ways he couldn't have imagined. And whether or not he was ready to face the consequences, the truth, whatever it might be, had now been brought to light. What do you think about this whole confrontation? Should Barron get the DNA test? Let us know what you think in the comments below.